So if you'll remember to remain muted and to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. I would like to introduce Deborah Dean, who will introduce our speaker and our session for today. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to the spring session, ILR, Women Adventurers. But before we even begin, I would like to acknowledge a birthday for our Julianne Ariette. ILR wouldn't happen without her persistence and her presence all the time. So I think we need to show her our appreciation. She's such a wonderful part of this ILR. So on the count of 3, I would like you all to join with me and say, happy birthday, Julianne. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday,
Julianne. In case you didn't know.
Welcome to our spring ILR offering of Women Adventurers. This series was intentionally planned to coincide with Women's History Month in March. Women's History Month is an annual declared month that highlights the contribution of women's events to history and contemporary society. It's celebrated during March in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, corresponding with International Women's Day on March 8th, and during October in Canada, corresponding with the celebration of Persons Day on October 18th. The commemoration began in 1978 as Women's History Day in Sonoma, California, and was championed by Gerda Lerner and the National Women's History Alliance to be recognized as a week in 1980 and then as a month in 1987 in the US, spreading internationally after that. And I really liked what Jimmy Carter had to say about Women's History Week in 1980. He issued a proclamation declaring the week March 8th as National Women's History Week. The proclamation stated, "From the first settlers who came to our shores, from the first American Indian families who befriended them, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well. As Gerda Lerner has noted, women's history is women's right. It's an essential and indispensable heritage from which we can draw pride, comfort, courage, and long-range vision." And the theme for the 2003 Women's History Month is, appropriately enough, celebrating women who tell our stories. So we have one today with us, and we'll have several more. I'd also like to, before we begin, dedicate this series to my late good friend and neighbor, Margaret Boonstra. For those of us fortunate enough to have known her, Margaret herself exemplified a woman adventurer. Following her graduation from Smith College, she went on to become the first woman in many settings. She became a Foreign Service officer, the only woman in her cohort of new diplomats, a Peace Corps official. She served as vice consul in Panama, program officer for Peace Corps in Brazil, Bolivia, and Uruguay, acting director of Peace Corps for Bolivia, staff assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State, and director of talent search for Peace Corps. She was the first woman to participate in the Army's jungle training school in Panama. After marriage, she and her husband, Claire, served as ambassadors in Costa Rica and Brazil. Margaret is the reason I'm on the ALR Humanities Committee and the Curriculum Committee. As most of you remember, you never said no to Margaret. And now for our first presentation on Women Adventurers, I'd like to introduce you to Barbara Oberlander, a familiar face and most welcome presenter. Barbara has been a resident of Gainesville since 1971. From 75 until 2005, she was a professor of history at Santa Fe College, where she served as Honors Program Coordinator, Associate Chair, and then Interim Chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. She holds a BA in Political Science from Wellesley, an MA in History from Case Western Reserve University, and a PhD in the History of American Civilization from Brandeis University. Her special interest is American history with a particular emphasis on women's history. She's been very active in community efforts to heighten awareness of women's role in American life. Since the fall of 2005, she's been a member of the Oak-Hammock's Institute for Learning and Retirement and has served on both Curriculum Committee and the Board of Directors, which she chaired from 2007 to 2009. So we'd all like to welcome Barbara and thank her for this kickoff presentation of Women Adventurers.
Okay, we have a variety of electronic equipment here, and I sort of feel like a space cadet, but I hope you all can hear me. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. In 1850, Stephen Foster, Pittsburgh's favorite son, and the author of many well-known songs about America, wrote a song called Nellie Bly. You see part of it up on the screen. It was a song that essentially was about his household servant, who was a woman of color, who he loved and respected, and you'll see that much of the song is in dialect. The song had a catchy tune and was picked up about 10 years later for a presidential campaign. But it didn't really become well-known and popular until it became the name of this young woman, an aspiring journalist who would, in many ways, pioneer the field of investigative journalism, change it forever, and who, at her peak, would not only be one of the best-known women in the United States, but one of the best-known women in the world. She was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in May of 1864 in Pitts Mill, Armstrong County, Pennsylvania. These are renditions of her parents, Mary Jane and Judge Michael Cochran. Her father had risen from mill worker to mill owner to associate county judge, and that's why he is referred to in this as Judge Michael Cochran. There were 15 children in the family, and Elizabeth was one of them. She was known as Pink because her mother insisted on dressing her in pink clothes at a time when most little girls wore darker colors. She was in pink. Her father was very wealthy, and they moved into a beautiful mansion when Pink was only 5 years old. But the very next year, Michael Cochran died suddenly without a will, and the family essentially was impoverished. Assets had to be sold off, the house had to be auctioned, and it was a huge turnaround for this family. Her mother, Mary Jane, quickly remarried, but divorced within a short period of time because her new husband was abusive. And actually, when she was only 14 years old, Pink testified at her mother's divorce hearing. And this is what she said. My stepfather has been generally drunk since he married my mother. When drunk, he is very cross and mean. He calls her names. There's no doubt that this left an indelible impression on a young girl and a desire always to be independent. She enrolled at Indiana Normal School in Western Pennsylvania with the thought of becoming a teacher. But the family's financial situation meant that she had to leave after 1 year. And so she moved with her mother to Pittsburgh, where her two brothers lived and had fairly good jobs. Now, Pittsburgh was known as the steel capital of the United States, and it had earned a reputation as, quote, the blackest, dirtiest, grimiest city in the whole country, with apologies to any of you who might be from Pittsburgh. In fact, one writer said that if you looked down on the city, it was like looking down on hell without a lid. This would be Pink's home for the next 7 years. Her mother ran a boarding house. Pink helped in the boarding house, and she took odd jobs working for families as a nanny, as a tutor, cleaning, whatever she could. She wanted a white-collar job like her brothers had, but she found that they were closed to women, even being a clerk. The clerks were all men. She met in the boarding house many young women who were forced to work in the steel plants, the glass factories, the foundries. She talked to them. She found out about horrible working conditions, about low wages, about how some of these young girls went into a marriage simply to escape their circumstances. And she never forgot what she heard. Now, Pittsburgh was a city of just 60,000 at that time, but it had 7 daily newspapers. The Dispatch, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which was in this beautiful vintage building, was one of the most popular newspapers, and it had the most respected columnist in the whole city. His name was Erasmus Wilson. He was called the Quiet Observer, so everyone referred to him as QO. And for 30 years, he wrote columns for the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Pink was an avid reader of newspapers, and one day she read a column he had written. It was in response to a man who had 5 daughters, and he wondered what he should do with these 5 daughters. Erasmus Wilson answered in a series of columns that it was essential for women to be wives and mothers. That was the route they should follow. They were useless outside of marriage. They should learn to spin, to sew, to cook, to raise obedient children, and to make their home, quote, a little paradise. Any woman who worked outside the home, he said, was, quote, a monstrosity. Pink read that series and she was enraged because, after all, she was coming in contact with young women who had to work. And she wrote a letter to the newspaper. She signed it, a lonely orphan girl. And she pointed out that QO really had no understanding of the true situation of young women in Pittsburgh. The letter fell on the desk of the Pittsburgh Dispatch's editor, and he was taken with the spirit of the letter, although he said the punctuation was horrible, the writing was horrible, the spirit was there, and maybe he should ask this young girl to identify herself and write more. So he put an ad in the paper asking the lonely orphan girl to identify herself. That was enough for Pink. She dashed down to the office of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. She presented herself, and he agreed to have her write an answer. You see the article on the right of the slide. It was called The Girl Puzzle. And this was her answer to Wilson. What should be done with all these girls? That was the puzzle. And she spoke about girls without talent, without education, without background, without money. And she said, why shouldn't they be put on the same training ladder that young men were? I mean, you could start off as a clerk and you could rise. Couldn't girls do that? They were just as smart as young men. They were quicker to learn. And she said, why can't they even be conductors on Pullman railroads? So she wrote a couple of articles. She was paid for the first article, and Madden was impressed. He asked her to write a second article, which she wrote. It was called Mad Marriages, and it was a plea for a change in Pennsylvania's divorce laws, shades of her experience with her mother. By that time, he was convinced that he had a talent on his hands. He offered her the grand total of $5 a week and hired her. But they didn't think the name Lonely Orphan Girl really was something they should carry through. So Madden asked the men in his office, we have to come up with another name. Female journalists weren't supposed to reveal their true identity. And they came up with the name Nellie Bly, after the Stephen Foster song. In their haste, they misspelled it. So instead of Nellie with a Y, we get Nellie I-E. And Elizabeth Jane Cochran now becomes Nellie Bly. And that's how she would be known after that. Over the time, Madden began assigning her stories about flower shows, fashion shows, society, etc. This is not what she wanted. She wanted to be a serious journalist. So she had the idea of becoming a foreign correspondent, and she went off to Mexico. And here she is in Mexico, where she produced a series of articles about Mexican society. She even went to a bullfight. She talked about poverty. She talked about the government. She talked about the control of the press. They were good articles. But when she came back to the United States, she was being assigned those fashion stories again. And this was not for her. So in true Nellie Bly fashion, she wrote a note, "Dear QO, I'm off to New York." And that's what she did. She went off to New York, which of course was the newspaper and publishing capital of the United States. There were countless newspapers, magazines, all kinds of printed material. And the place to be was Newspaper Row in New York City, where there were several outstanding papers, the Tribune, the Times, the Herald, the World. There was fierce competition among these papers. You would see newsboys selling the papers for just a penny on street corners. But of all the competitors, this one with Joseph Pulitzer as the owner, was one to be aware of, the New York World. Joseph Pulitzer was determined to outsell every other newspaper. And so he had stories that would appeal to the immigrants who were starting to flood into New York, stories about murder or riots or scandals, things that would capture human attention and sell his newspapers. Nellie made the rounds of the New York papers. She tried every single one, and they all said, no, we can't hire a woman journalist because we can't send her to cover a prison riot or a murder or a fire. It's much too dangerous. And so she came up with a plan. She would write a series on how hard it was for a woman journalist to get a job in New York. And she made appointments with all the editors. No editor really wanted to hire her, but they would answer the question about women journalists and why it wasn't a good field for them. And finally, she talked her way into the office of Colonel John Cockrell, who was the editor of the New York World. And she wouldn't leave until he gave her a hearing. And finally, he said to her, okay, you really want to be a woman journalist? Are you willing to take a risk? I have an assignment for you. And if you take this assignment and are successful, we will hire you. The assignment was to go undercover at New York's infamous lunatic asylum. It was the hospital on Blackwell's Island. Here's a rather idyllic rendition of this infamous place. Charles Dickens had visited it. Other people had visited. It had a really horrifying reputation as to what went on there. But when reporters showed up, they were given sort of a standard tour. Cockrell wanted somebody to go undercover and to write articles from first-person experience, not statistics. And she agreed. Nellie Bly agreed. This is the famous spiral staircase at the mental hospital. If you think about it, it was a brilliant strategy on the part of the editor. Nellie Bly had to have enormous courage to do this, and she did. She checked herself into a boarding house. She changed her name to Nellie Brown. She practiced seeming to be demented or crazed. These are the illustrations that would appear later in the articles. The woman who owned the boarding house became alarmed, called the police. The police took her to the court for a hearing. And after the hearing, 3 experts decided that she was suffering from dementia, that she was indeed crazed, and they took her by ferry to the hospital on Blackwell Island. She fooled everyone, including the reporters that the judge had called in to see if there was somehow a missing girl in the city and the reporters could help find her family. And the experience that she had here would be something that would change society's view of this hospital and bring about needed reforms. Here's another illustration of her being examined by a psychiatrist from 10 Days in a Madhouse, which was the book she would publish about her experience. She was released after 10 days when Pulitzer sent an attorney and they obtained her release. And then came the series of articles. They were published not only in the New York World, but in other New York newspapers, and indeed all over the country. Here you see excerpts from West Virginia, from Iowa. What she described was horrifying. And as various people have commented, this was probably the most dangerous thing that she did. She saw the madhouse as a place where insanity was not cured, but created. This is what she wrote. Take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit up straight from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Don't allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her nothing to read. Let her know nothing of the world or its doings, and see how long it will take to make her insane. She said that meal times were punctuated with a special kind of terror because inmates choked down stale bread and rancid butter, and if they didn't eat, they were threatened with punishment. But the worst experience she described was being given a bath. She was made to stand naked in a tub, and then freezing cold water was poured over her. Quote, my teeth chattered and my limbs were goose-fleshed and blue with cold. Suddenly, I got 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water, into my eyes, my ears, my nose, and my mouth. I think I experienced the sensation of a drowning person as they dragged me, gasping, shivering, and quaking from the tub. For once, I did look insane. And she wrote of listening to the screams of a young woman who the doctors had bathed and then punished her by beating her. And the next morning, the woman was dead. So it was a horrifying tale that she revealed. Here are some of her quotes about it. I always had a desire to know asylum life more thoroughly, a desire to be convinced that the most helpless of God's creatures, the insane, were cared for kindly and properly. Obviously not so. Could I pass a week in the insane ward at Blackwell's Island? I said I could, and I would, and I did. I always made a point of telling the doctors I was sane and asking to be released, but the more I endeavored to assure them of my sanity, the more they doubted it. She published the series in a book, 10 Days in a Madhouse. It made her instantly famous. And if you are up to it, you can even watch recent movies about her experience. There was one made in 2015 and one made just 4 years ago. So, what Nellie Bly has done is pioneer a new kind of journalism. They have called it stunt journalism. We would call it the beginning of investigative reporting. And indeed, she is a pioneer in this field. But it was so popular and sold so many papers, which made Pulitzer very happy, that he then hired a whole group of other women to do exactly the same thing. Nellie Bly was clearly the best, and there are other stories. She went undercover for including the sale of babies in New York for $10. And she uncovered that. She pretended at first supposed to be an unwed mother and then a woman who was interested in buying a child. This slide shows you how her report not only sold papers, but made a difference. That after this, the New York legislature appropriated much more money to mental hospitals, and they had all kinds of reform. If you're wondering what happened to the hospital on Blackwell's Island, within 10 years it was closed. Then it became kind of a public hospital, eventually fell into disrepair, and today the only thing that's remaining is the turret, which is part of a residential complex. Here, the headlines from the New York World: Nellie Bly buys a baby, an innocent child sold into slavery for $10. And she talks about the traffic in human flesh in New York, heartless mothers, grasping midwives who barter helpless children for money. At the end, I bought a baby last week to learn how baby slaves are bought and sold. Think of it, an immortal soul bartered for $10. So there were revelations about this. There were revelations about employment agencies that took advantage of young immigrant women who had just come to New York. There were revelations about corruptions in Albany. She posed as a lobbyist and actually led to one of the congressmen there leaving his job. And so the stories kept coming, and they were very important in changing not only the whole field of journalism, but showing what women reporters could do. But that wasn't all. By 1889, 2 years after her stint in the mental hospital, Bly was restless. And she had an idea. The idea was to take on Jules Verne. Jules Verne, of course, who is known all over the world, had written a series of best-selling adventure novels. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Journey to the Center of the Earth, and he had written a very popular book called Around the World in 80 Days, which featured Phileas Fogg and his French valet going around the world in 80 days. Nellie Bly went to the editor of the New York World and proposed that she could go around the world in less than 80 days. She would take on Jules Verne. The editor said, absolutely not. Too dangerous for women. Women can't do this. Women travel with 12 trunks of clothes. Women won't be safe around the world. Absolutely not. She persisted. They liked the idea, and the rumor was that they were going to hire a man to do it. Nellie Bly stormed into the office and said, okay, let me know when he sets out. I'll set out the same day and I will beat him. And so they finally agreed that Nellie Bly would try to outdo the 80-day trip around the world. And here she is. And the case you see is what she traveled with. Only it was 16 inches wide and 7 inches high. She wore this outfit She carried a few veils, slippers, toilet articles, some changes of underwear, pen and paper, not much else. These were the publicity photos taken by the New York World as she set out. She set sail in November of 1889. First, she went to London, and there she was told that Jules Verne wanted to meet with her. This is a scene taken from a play about the meeting of Jules Verne and Nellie Bly. Verne and his wife went to meet her at the train station in Amiens, France. And when he saw her, he was shocked. He said, "Is it possible that this child is traveling around the world? She's a mere baby." He was curious about her route. She shared it with him, and you can see from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, this is her route, departing from Jersey City, New Jersey, then to London, to France, Italy, Egypt, Yemen, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, then back to San Francisco, and eventually back to New Jersey. Verne said to her, "If you do it in 79 days, I shall applaud with both hands. But if you do it in 75, mon Dieu, that would be a miracle." He wished her well. He didn't believe she could do it. He was wrong. Nellie Bly was one determined young woman. She traveled 24,899 miles in 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes. This is one of the most closely followed journeys in world history. You have to understand, it was like the space shuttle of its day. Everybody was following the journey of Nellie Bly. The world, of course, published all kinds of games about this. This is one of them. Front page news. This is a woodcut image of her homecoming reception in Jersey City. She kept very careful record of what she saw, what she did, who she met. But of course, the reports wouldn't get back to New York in time to really publish them. So she sent very small cables with just a few sentences, and they kind of embellished what she sent until she actually came home. There were games created. This is one by the McLaughlin brothers. There were medications sold under the Nellie Bly name. These are mandrake pills for liver complaints. When there's Nellie Bly. This was actually created just 6 years ago, a Nellie Bly card. She would publish a book, of course, Around the World with Nellie Bly. When she got to San Francisco, she then went on a train across the country to New Jersey. She described this transcontinental trip. She said it was, quote, "a maze of happy greetings, happy wishes, congratulatory telegrams, fruit, flowers, cheers. It was like a queen's ride," unquote. There were cheering crowds everywhere. When the San Francisco Chronicle remarked that her journey was remarkable, her response was, quote, "Oh, I don't know. It is not so very much for a woman to be." who has the pluck, energy, and independence which characterize many women in this day of push and get there. What a wonderful response. That's 1890. And she's saying there's a new woman that's appearing in the United States, and this woman can do anything. She saw herself as representing this new woman who was emerging. Now, I should tell you that there was another woman who set out the same time as Nellie Bly. Her name was Elizabeth Bisland, and she wrote for Cosmopolitan magazine, and she really was more of a literary critic. But the editor and owner of Cosmopolitan thought this is a wonderful stunt to create publicity. Why don't we ask someone on our staff to do it? So Elizabeth Bisland was chosen, and here you can see from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, they were pictured as the rival tourists. There's a good rendition of Elizabeth Bisland. It took her 76 and a half days. There is a children's book, of course, called A Race Around the World, the true story of Nellie Bly and Elizabeth Bisland. So by 1890, Nellie Bly was in her element. She continued to write. In fact, she wrote novels. She wrote 12 novels. They were sort of romantic, melodrama, adventure kind of novels. They had a formula. You know, there was a woman who was the main star, who was the heroine. Generally, she fell in love with the wrong kind of person. They were separated for a while, then reunited. There was scandal. I mean, it was sort of a formulaic way of writing these, but they were popular. And here is one of them, Dolly the Coquette, heiress to millions, a thrilling love story of intense interest. She continued to interview people, and this is her interview with one of my heroines, Susan B. Anthony, in 1896. And it's interesting, the Nellie Bly interviews ask questions that other people might be afraid to ask. For example, she asked Susan B. Anthony if she had ever considered marriage or she had ever been in love. When she met with a famous boxer, she wanted to know how he calm down. You know, did he take a cold shower after the boxing match? I mean, these were the kinds of questions that other people wouldn't ask, but Nellie Bly would. And then this independent woman in her early 30s shocked everyone by marrying someone 40 years older. Robert Seaman, owner of the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. He was a multimillionaire bachelor. The Ironclad Manufacturing Company was a very, very successful company that made all kinds of steel products. And at first, people thought it was another stunt. You know, is this serious? But no. They were actually married, and for a time, she retired from journalism and became a businesswoman and an inventor. She went to the Pan American Exposition in 1901, and this is her card. The ironclad factories are the largest of their kind and owned exclusively by Nellie Bly, the only woman in the world personally managing industries of such a magnitude. She patented about 24 different items, including this one. This is a milk can. This is a metal barrel. When her husband died in 1903, she took over the company totally, ran it successfully for a while, but then became the victim of embezzlement, and the company went bankrupt. So in her later years, she returned to journalism. She covered the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. This was a huge event of women who were advocating for the right to vote, and they timed this parade to match Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as president. And Nellie Bly was given the honor of riding in this suffrage parade, and you can see her on the right. In 1914, she happened to be traveling in Austria. She was there when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated. So Nellie Bly was in Europe when World War I broke out. And she became a war correspondent. And here she is talking to an Austrian officer, who was lecturing her essentially on the colors of the clothes that she wore because they would attract too much attention. Her reports about the war are quite incredible. In a sense, she was one of the first women war journalists, and her descriptions are very vivid. Headlines like, quote, hides in trenches as Russian shells rain around her. She went to field hospitals. She talked to nurses who were from several different countries. She saw the injured, and she wrote, quote, how can the emperors, the czars, and the kings look on this slaughter and ever sleep again? She traveled the roads from the scenes of the battles. She saw the trains, the wounded, staring ahead. And when you read her descriptions, what comes to mind are the paintings that were done about World War I. This is Gassed by John Singer Sargent. Here's Nellie Bly's description. A continuous straggling stream of sick and wounded soldiers was always coming toward us. Sometimes they saluted, more often they staggered unconsciously and forlornly, their sunken eyes fixed pathetically on the west, blind to their surroundings, their ears deaf to the near and ceaseless thundering of cannons, their nerves dead to the awful whizzing of the bombs as they whirled above our heads, so near yet never visible in our eyes. A dressing station in France, and she described in vivid terms the kind of wounds that soldiers were getting in World War I and the inability of the doctors and nurses to save them, to treat them. So she wasn't actually the very first woman war correspondent. There was a woman who covered the Spanish-American War, but there's no doubt that Nellie Bly opens the way for other women journalists who will become very important in wartime, especially during World War II. Here she is about 1920, a rather magnificent picture of her. She died 2 years later in 1922 of pneumonia, and this is her gravestone. She's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in New York. Of course, a stamp issued Worthy of an American Legend, it was called when it was issued. This was a whole series of stamps that were issued in tribute to American women journalists. There is a historical marker in front of the house that she lived in Apollo, Pennsylvania. There are books. There are many books about Nellie Bly. The one on the left is a children's book, and it's called Nellie Bly's Monkey, because when she was in Singapore, she bought a monkey named McGinty and took that monkey with her on the rest of her journey. And so, of course, they created a children's book around that. And then recently, this. Just 2 years ago, this was installed on Roosevelt Island, very close to the original site of the mental hospital where Nellie Bly first made her reputation. It is called the Girl Puzzle Monument. You will recall that her first newspaper article was called The Girl Puzzle. And the woman who created this, Amanda Matthews, wanted to pay tribute to Nellie Bly. And so what you have here are essentially 5 giant faces of women. They were about 7 feet tall. And there is Nellie Bly. And the other 4 women represent women who were either important to Nellie Bly or important to the artist. I always like to end with quotes, as some of you know. And I like this one from Nellie Bly. I have never written a word that did not come from my heart. I never shall. I was too impatient to work at the usual duties assigned women on newspapers. Well, that's an understatement, to be sure. She was too impatient. She was not going to accept those society assignments. I've always had the feeling that nothing is impossible if one applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction. If you want to do it, you can do it. So Nellie Bly, a pioneer in investigative journalism. By her death in the 1920s, there were many other investigative reporters, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, many others, whose work not only sold newspapers or books, but brought about social change. And that's what Nellie Bly wanted. She is part of the journey of women reporters to be accepted as serious writers and as war reporters. And in a sense, she paves the way for this new woman who is emerging in the early 20th century, a woman who's unafraid of adventure and unafraid of doing things that weren't thought proper for women. So Nellie Bly is truly a woman adventurer, and indeed someone that I think we should all admire and be in awe of. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Barbara, sensational as always. I would like to know how Nellie Bly got from that first letter she had written to the editor, and he said it was poorly punctuated and the spelling, to being able to be a journalist.
Did you all hear the question from Betty? Former English teacher. Perfect question, right? You know, I looked for a copy of that first letter that she wrote to the editor, and I haven't been able to find it. It may be there somewhere, but she obviously honed her skills. I mean, and the first letter she wrote in response to Erasmus Wilson's idea that any woman working was a monstrosity was a letter that she wrote when she was so very angry. And so I think that might have shown in the letter where afterwards she had time to, you know, kind of perfect what she was writing. She had a year of college, you know, so she essentially had some skills. But if you look at her writings, they are designed for a specific audience. There's no doubt about it. But she wrote well. It's a great question, Betty.
Let's do Shirley Bloodworth here on Zoom. Go ahead.
Hello, Barbara. What another wonderful, wonderful woman story. We need them. We need a lot of them. My question is, in today's arena in Florida, is this one of the banned books? I can see where it would be.
All heard the question. Is it a banned book? Not that I'm aware of.
It will be.
Are you talking about the book that you wrote about her experience in the mental hospital, or any of her books?
Any of her books that takes women out of the home.
Well, the romantic novels were kind of lost for a long time because they were serialized in sort of a Sunday newspaper. So they've only recently been discovered. But as far as I know, there's been no move to ban any of her books.
Thank you for sharing so much, Barbara.
Here in the Oak Room.
Wonderful lecture. I'd like to ask you, after her husband died and the business failed, was she left any money, and how was she able to survive after that for a while?
Yeah, there's quite a story about after the business failed, there was actually a trial and a court case about the money that was lost. She was really left in dire financial circumstances and used journalism as a way to make a living, but she did not die a wealthy woman.
Deb, right over here. Mr. Gilkey.
Jules Verne's book shows a hot air balloon for traveling around the world. How did she move around the world?
It's a great question. She did not travel in a hot air balloon. She traveled by train, by animal, by boat, kind of traditional methods. No hot air balloon.
Pat Collier, you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yes, Barbara, thank you so much. I believe you said there were 15 children in the family. Is that correct? Did any of the others ever make a mark in any way?
Not that I'm aware of. There were 15 children from 2 marriages. Her father was married originally, and then her mother was his second wife. So, and he had, I think, 10 children before he married again, and then had another 5. But you don't hear about the other children except in passing that her brothers, who had much less education than she had, were able to get much better jobs in Pittsburgh.
Did she have to support some of the sisters and brothers at any point? Was she supporting them?
Not that I know of, Pat.
I thought I saw another hand. Oh, Heather, okay.
Did she ever get an apology from OW on being called a monster?
What was that?
Did she ever get an apology from
Oh,
OQ?
oh, QO, the quiet observer. I don't think so. No, I mean, not an apology, but he was intrigued by bringing her on to write a response to his columns.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Usually, when you take a trip like that, you have contacts lined up in advance. So I'm wondering, how in the world did she get transport from, Singapore and various places
She arranged it
on the spot?
and mostly on the spot, although the world was helpful. They had given her some money. They had given her money in British pounds. They also gave her some American money to see whether she could spend that. But she did most of the arrangements, and with the world, most of the arrangements were done that way. They wanted her to take a revolver, and she said, absolutely not. Because they were afraid she couldn't protect herself, but they didn't know Nellie Bly. I should say that when, during the travels, at one point she went to a Hindu temple, but she wasn't allowed inside. And she was furious about that. She didn't understand why she couldn't go inside. And the man tried to explain it to her, and she tried to explain to him why she should be allowed in, but it didn't happen.
Thank you. Is there any indication that what she viewed as her greatest accomplishments as she reflected back on her life? She lived into her 90s, didn't she?
No,
How?
she was, she lived into her 50s.
50s, okay. Was there any indication what she thought was her greatest accomplishment?
Well, she was very proud of the reforms that came in the treatment of people who were mentally ill. That was very important to her, because what she found was that many of the young women who were confined in the mental hospital were simply women who couldn't speak English well. And they were young immigrant women, and they couldn't make themselves understood. So she was very pleased with the fact that there were reforms given, the place was changed and shut down in 10 years. She was very proud of course, her trip around the world. But I think what she was proudest of is giving a voice to people who didn't have a voice. The working girls, the people confined to the mental institution, the mothers who were selling their babies. So I think she was proudest of that. She really did, in many ways, give a voice to people who did not have a public voice. And that was her accomplishment.
Was there anyone on Zoom that I missed that had a comment or another question?
Yeah, Janet Janke in a chat says,
Oh, yeah, right here.
Chelsea Clinton wrote a book, She Persisted, 13 American Women Who Changed the World. Nellie Bly was one that is included in this book.
Yeah.
Any other questions here in our Oak Room?
We thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I just really enjoyed this. But why had I never heard of Nellie Bly before? I mean, Margaret Sanger, all these women suffragists, but yet Nellie Bly had to have been a model for many of them.
Here's the button.
Yes.
Write women back into history.
Well, there were so many women we don't hear of. I mean, I had Nellie Bly sort of back in my memory, but honestly, I would not have done a presentation if I had not talked to Deborah. And she had told me about the class that she was doing on women adventurers, and she threw out a bunch of names. And as soon as she said Nellie Bly, I said, oh, I'll do her, knowing that in the back of my mind, I probably should have researched her before. But there's a PBS special on her through American Experience that's wonderful. I think once that monumental sculpture went up on Roosevelt Island, and that was just a couple of years ago, there's been a lot more publicity. But yeah, I mean, she is really a fascinating woman in so many ways. And you can go online, for those of you who love to go online, and if you put in her name, you can actually get a collection of all of her articles, of which there are hundreds. It's a little difficult to read them on a screen, but they're there. Somebody has gone to the trouble of collecting them all.
Well, I want to thank Deb, too, for taking on Margaret's idea. When you showed the picture of her in Mexico, I said to Deb, oh, Margaret would have loved that she went to Mexico. Thank you both again. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful start to the program.
Barbara.